Right. So good morning, everyone, and welcome officially to this Food Focus webinar. We are so excited to have it sponsored by FACTS. FACTS is the Food and Allergy Consulting and Testing Services. I'm sure some of you must have heard of them before. They're a great organization that help the food industry on an ongoing basis to ensure that we can have a good handle on what's happening with food allergies, and more recently and very, very importantly, dealing with food fraud. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you our speakers. And before we get going with the topics for discussion, just wanted to make sure everybody understands how the webinar works, because some of you may be attending for the very first time. If this is the case, where have you been? But welcome, it's so great to have you, and we really hope that this is not the last webinar that you join us at Food Focus. Hopefully by now you figured out that you can't talk. You will be on mute throughout the webinar. However, you can talk to us using the question or the chat bar, which is on your right hand side. So please feel free to jot down any questions that you may have, so that you can give us the opportunity to ask those questions to the speakers at the end of the webinar. The intention is definitely not for it to be a one-way discussion, but the point is to try and assist you with some of the very specific requirements that you have in your facilities, and in the kind of work that you're doing, whether you're regulatory or whether you're actually trying to manage it in the trenches in the food organization you work for. If for some reason we do lose you during the course of the webinar, please don't panic. The webinar is being recorded, and a link will be sent to you as soon as the webinar has been edited and has been placed on our Food Focus website, and then you'll be able to definitely download it and enjoy it if by any chance you have to leave during the course of the morning. We'd also appreciate any feedback that you have regarding the webinar. If there are questions or problems that you experience, or opportunities that you have to help us to improve, please, we'd love to hear from you, because that way we know that people are actually enjoying the information that we have and taking note of it. So now it gives me great pleasure to tell you who's going to be talking to you today. So Karim, if you could move down the first slide, please, so that I can see the amazing bio of Dr. Harris Steinman. So for those of you that don't know Harris, he is the CEO of FACTS. He's also a great opinion leader. He's got some very outspoken opinions, but some very, very valid comments to make on some very controversial but absolutely critical aspects of the work that we do in the food industry. I like to say that Harris keeps us honest. He loves to interact with the food industry and be on the cutting edge when it comes to, expertise in testing, regulatory services, food fraud, and they keep us up to date in the food industry here in South Africa. Harris has been in the food industry for a very, very long time, and so he's been involved in numerous food fraud research projects. He does a great presentation and talk, which is what you're going to enjoy today. And the analysis within the laboratory includes those testing methods which help you to identify whether your products have actually been adulterated. They can tell you whether you've got a problem with animal species. Is this kangaroo, or is this in fact beef? Microscopic analysis of your product. So has your product been diluted? Honey adulteration, amongst others. And of course, the 2013 horse meat scandal is probably his most influential research, and I think we're still feeling some of the ripple effects from that today, Harris. Today he's going to be talking to us about how we understand the horizon with regards to food fraud, what are the tools that are available, and something that I have to tell you about Harris, which I find fascinating, and that is that he loves photography, and he's in fact probably as good a photographer as he is a scientist. So Harris, we can't wait to hear from you today. And over to you. I think the next slide is also going to give us an introduction before Harris starts talking, and that is possibly the new kid on the block, Karim, could I put it like that, as being the newest member of the FACTS team. He's the Senior Scientific Officer. Karim's speciality is customized analytical services. He's got amazing research capabilities in biochemistry, and using this analytical knowledge, he's able to assist in designing a bespoke solution for your problems. He's lectured in biochemical theory and techniques. He's worked professionally in both public and private STEM sectors in South Africa as well as internationally. You will hear when he starts speaking that he's definitely not South African born, and he's going to be telling us how we can use analysis as a tool for managing vulnerabilities. He's also a very successful entrepreneur, and he started a number of businesses, including South Africa's first bottled fermented mead. I can't wait to taste that, Karim. So after your presentation, perhaps we can share a drink. Harris, over to you. We're looking forward to your presentation on how we can scan the horizon for food fraud activities. Are we all happy on that side? Just checking the sound. That's the problem. Karim, I need you to unmute yourself, please. I'm not able to do it from my side.
Hi, everyone.
There we go.
Thank you.
Now we've got.
Thanks for the introduction. Thanks to everybody for joining us. We're excited to have you here with us so that we can talk about some ideas. Today, I'm obviously focusing on horizon scanning, and you may have attended previous talks I gave on food fraud, which is far more interesting in that I filled it with lots of examples from around South Africa and the world of how food fraud has started dominating the conversation. And from a scientific point of view, we tend to try and put it into boxes and characterize it. And this slide just talks about the terminology that we use around food fraud, where we talk about substitution, where you substitute olive oil with sunflower oil, where you conceal things, where you mislabel, which is a very big current problem in South Africa. But we're not actually focusing on this area at all today. We're talking in general about a food safety management system, an approach to food fraud prevention. And to remind you that food safety management system is umbrella for a number of areas. The first one that we've known for many years, which is food safety, which is HACCP, and the two new kids on the block, which is food defense and food fraud. Now, just to put that into context, food defense goes by the term TACCP versus food fraud, which is VACCP. And the food defense is behaviorally or ideologically motivated, whereas VACCP is economically motivated. And it's obviously to do with a frame set of the person who's trying to commit fraud. Horizon scanning, which is looking at the future and trying to predict what's going to happen, falls clearly and directly under VACCP. And what the difference is really is we're shifting from risk to the company and the products and our future to the vulnerability. Basically, risk is something that has occurred before, will occur again, so we can learn from it and we can develop the pattern, whereas vulnerability is the exposure to risk, whether it's happened before or not. In other words, we have to start trying to imagine what the future might be. So the paradigm has shifted from reactionary to preventative. We see the same thing in medicine. We try and prevent a disease rather than end up having to cure a disease. So we need to start predicting from important medium to long-term issues so that we can start developing preventative actions today for what might happen in the future. And I'll cover that as we move along. So horizon scanning is a vital tool that should be used to gather information about the future is going to affect your business. And we're looking at right from farm to fork to regulatory to environment to politics, and you'll see how that becomes more clear. So what is horizon scanning? Well, it's just really a method that falls under what's called foresight methodologies. And foresight methodologies seeks to gather data and make sense of it so we can understand how the future goes. And it's in fact a tool that's used extensively in medicine, in climate change, in biodiversity, and we're now starting to apply the same principles to the food industry. Now, it's under the radar of FAO, and they have defined it as a specific foresight methodology that utilizes various steps to identify issues at the edge of current thinking that may have a significant impact in the medium to long-term future. So you can see the same things are recurring. It's about identifying issues to look towards a medium and long-term future. And it involves gathering data across a range of sources and domains. So it's not just about food. We have to understand how technology is going to impact food production and manufacturing, how environment, how political issues will change the systems, legal issues, and even the ethics of, for example, how do we mine our environment for the food that we are feeding our consumers. This is a very good organogram that basically just shows how all of these things impact on how we have to look at horizon scanning and try and see the future. And one of the most interesting aspects of it is also how consumers see the future. Do we get tip-offs from how consumers are viewing food production? So is there complaints and whistleblowing, or is there a focus on particular areas that are going to influence our future? Gluten, how people suddenly become very gluten intolerant or trying to avoid gluten foods, even though they're not gluten intolerant, is a good example of being able to keep a handle on what's happening around us and try and predict where the future is going to be. And so what we do is we have to use data and information sources, and that's obviously scientific data from academic institutions, how regulatory compliance and regulations change, are the incidents being reported that is alerting us to what is happening now and maybe in the future, and then looking at a whole lot of other areas such as market signals, internet and social media analytics. In a sense, we're trying to get as much intelligence and data as we can to try and inform us of what might happen tomorrow or a few months from now or a few years from now or even further ahead. So basically, effective horizon scanning framework requires a capability of identifying emerging risks and vulnerabilities across the whole supply chain, as I hinted earlier. But the most critical aspect of this is not just being able to collect the data, but how do we interpret the data and evidence? And that is where the skill has to come through. And does your company have the manpower to be able to interpret all the data? Do you have the manpower to collect all this data? And that's where outside consulting groups or so can obviously be of use. So in a sense, we have to start understanding how the whole situation evolves from that. So are there constraints? Because it sounds a wonderful tool. Well, clearly there's some massive constraints here. Firstly, it won't give you answers. It actually raises more questions because you can't predict the future necessarily. It's not a risk assessment exercise, which we are used to, but a risk prioritization exercise. And knowing what it can't do is just as important as knowing what it can do. And that's critical because we're being asked to predict when we don't necessarily have all those tools. So the limitations are a number of gaps in the data and information sources, and I'll illustrate that in a second. And here, for example, is Scotland trying to develop a horizon scanning process. This is all the groups in Scotland that can assist a central directive to try and make the sense of data and information. Look at extensive information sources available to Scotland. In South Africa, we don't even have half of this. We have a defunct regulatory system. We've got EHPs that can't perform. We've got a lack of credible linkages between academic institutions and all the different sources. So we are on a back foot, and I'll address this in the future of this talk. So we have limitations, and that is the expertise to support analysis and interpretation needed to provide a fully comprehensive picture, as well as a weakness in the strengths of the networks, the data collection, the analysis and interpretation. That doesn't mean that we can't do something. We have to also understand there's always a subjective element. If we're trying to understand the politics of a country that is a major supplier of wheat in the future, we don't actually know who's going to be the next head of, say, America, and how they might influence how wheat is supplied around the world. So there is a subjective element in how we predict the future. And then we have to understand that we can be more accurate with short-term predictions versus mid-term, and long-term is sometimes partly guesswork, but with a lot of data, making it a fairly accurate type of guesswork. Now, is horizon scanning important to your company? And the answer is actually yes. It might appear to be on the horizon for you, but right now, if we look at the BRC, it considers horizon scanning to be integral to understanding of risks to food authenticity. So it is a requirement for BRC issue 7 and BRC issue 8, although the words horizon scanning themselves do not appear in the standards as horizon scanning. This is what the relevant clause says. 5.4.1 says processes in place to access information on historical and developing threats to the supply chain, which may present a risk of. In other words, it's making it very clear you need to look towards the future and start taking action to protect yourself and your company. Now, if we have a look at some of the elements involved, we can look back at a FAO horizon scanning survey done in 2013, which will sort of give you a good idea of what this involves. They looked at companies, major companies, and individuals in companies, and they did key interviews and internal questionnaires to identify what companies and individuals in companies, thought leaders, would consider as relevant, and how would you utilize horizon scanning. And they found over 40 emerging issues or topics, almost 30 drivers of change related to the above. And there's no time to discuss all of them, but I want to focus on a few to point out how one approaches this. So if we look at the 40 emerging issues or topics, they fell into 4 themes. And that were surveillance-related important issues, animal, plant, food health, climate change monitoring. There were 11 of those, production-related important emerging issues, socio-economical, etc. Now, let's focus just on a few of the production-related emerging issues to illustrate this point, of which there were 12. Here they are: food traceability, bioinformatics, food security, etc. Let's focus on eradication of certain fish species. Well, if we get rid of lobsters because of overfishing, or hake, as in South African context, how do you change a product that is core to your industry, say lobster or hake? How do you substitute it? Will it kill off your company? Are you going to be able to substitute it with a mock crayfish or a different type of fish? That is, for example, what horizon scanning says. How are you going to deal with an element that is core to your business disappearing? How are you going to manage that? If we look at environmental related emerging issues, how is climate change going to impact crop production? If your core business is oats as part of cereals, are you going to be able to substitute it? How are you going to protect that ingredient? If we have a look at drivers of change, there were 4 major themes: the market related drivers, production-related drivers, environmental-related drivers, and so on. Sociological would be included there. Let's look at an example of environmental-related drivers. Here are a number of them. Let's focus on biodiversity. An example is cacao or chocolate. Now, cacao chocolate has the biggest production in the world is only based on one particular species of cocoa. If that one species develops a disease, it wipes out that whole cocoa crop. There's no security. So how else do you deal with that? So if you're going to look into the future, you have to say, how do we develop other species of cacao that if one species develops a disease, the others are safe from and protected, our industry is protected. Now, if we have a look at some of the drivers of change, we can see these are the major ones, of which climate change is not just about getting hotter or colder, but climate change results in flooding of plains, for example, rice paddies, which is critical for rice production. For an area becoming wetter, so aflatoxin levels might become a problem in certain crops because of the humidity changing. So climate change is quite an incredibly important element, not just about hot and cold, rain, but how pesticide usage is going to change, pesticide residue. We have to understand it in the biggest sense of the term. Here are some examples. With vanilla, the vanilla price of vanilla is soaring due to poor harvest in Madagascar and Indonesia. But how many people know that there are only really 2 species of vanilla? And if there's any disease affecting 1 or 2 of these species, we have a serious problem. With dried fruit, another very good example. There was a significant price decline in Turkish sultanas and raisins blamed on high production levels. But what people don't know is that Turkey had stockpiled raisins since 2005, and these were produced with a particular pesticide which has now been banned in the EU. So if you are importing sultanas and raisins from Turkey, you have to know that possibly what is being imported now contains a pesticide that has become illegal. We see the same thing with olive oil production, which in the EU is up by 2.1%. Whereas the estimation of consumption suggests an increase of 3.2%. Where does all of this olive oil come from? Can the world produce as much olive oil as required? We have the same situation in South Africa. The olive oil being imported, is it all pure olive oil or is it adulterated with other oils? And the future is not going to get better. So how do you plan for the future? We know that droughts can affect Pakistan or other parts of the world sporadically, and they are critical for cumin production, which results in cumin adulteration. What will happen 10 years from now? If there's a war in Pakistan, what will happen to cumin supply to your company? And what if it's a key ingredient in one of your sauces? So we see this in a range of areas. Heavy metal contamination of crops from surrounding factories in China. Are you importing any of your ingredients from there? Is it going to get worse 10 years from now? And so on. We see that as a future, that is a warning to us, and that's where horizon scanning comes critically into how we plan ahead. Now, from what I've said, it says, well, if we can't do all of this, if we don't have all of the role players in the South African context, can we therefore do any horizon scanning? So it raises the question, do we do all or do we do nothing? And the answer is not really all or nothing. Obviously, we use as much of what we can use around the world and locally to make reasonable predictions. And one of these, for example, is using tools. And there are a number of databases that allow you to see what has happened in the past and can that help you predict towards the future. And these are critical tools. We use it for some of our clients, and I'll illustrate that in a second. So we have a number of these tools that are available. Some are free, some unfortunately you have to subscribe to. But these all help you give ideas of where the world might be going and predicting, at least in the short term to medium term, if not necessarily long term, but it gives you an idea. So if we have a look at, for example, the Discerners tool, which is a database of recorded incidents, we can see very clearly from this slide how we can predict. If we look at 2000 to 2009, we can see that dairy ingredients was one of the most common adulterated foods, whereas from 2010 to 2019 it's changed to seafood. This allows us to start saying, well, what has changed in the environment? Where is the risks now moving to? If we have a look at ingredients, the tool helps us to tell us what are the most common ingredients that are repeat offenders. Where is the patterns? Patterns allows us to predict. Here you can see apple juice, beef, etc. are very common. It also allows us, tools allows us to tell what is the common adulterant. So here we see with apple juice a range of different things that are commonly used to adulterate apple juice. And from that we can predict. We can see high fructose corn syrup, sugar mixture. All of these are things that help us to decide and help you to say, well, if you're bringing in apple juice, what are the risks? What should we be looking for? Is there tests we can develop to look for this? And we'll address that in a second. So we see the same with black pepper oleoresin, which comes from papaya seed oil, known as pawpaw. We've seen that happening where peppercorns, black peppercorns, are substituted with pawpaw seeds. They look so similar when they dry. And then the change of coffee where different species are interchanged. We can also try and identify, using the tool, what are the common adulterants in, for example, cow's milk. And the mind boggles that there are so many ways that people try and adulterate milk, particularly in India and Pakistan. Recent incidents, and this is in the last year, Sudan red, dye adulteration of red palm oil, still ongoing problems throughout the world, lard adulteration of chocolate. I guess that surprises you. Well, is that current in South Africa? Has anybody looked? Sugar syrups in honey? Well, we're picking that up in our lab. So this is ongoing incidents that we can predict short term is going to happen, medium term, and how is things going to change in the future? Because one of the things that we do understand is that people who work in this market think like criminals. We have to think like criminals. In other words, they're saying, how do we get around the systems? How do we get around the tests? How do we get around regulations? We have to think like criminals to try and combat fraud, and that is critical. And so, since they are thinking ahead, we have to start thinking of tests of how to combat this. And that's a section that Karim will be addressing shortly. So, in conclusion, the food control paradigm has shifted from reactionary to preventative. We have to have predictive approaches. Effective horizon scanning is a framework which requires the capability of identifying emerging risks and vulnerabilities across the whole supply chain, from the farm all the way to reaching the consumer. We have to learn how to interpret data and evidence from a diverse range of sources, scientific, economic, investigative, and that's what one of the areas we like to focus on. And that concludes my talk, and there will be some time for questions after Karim's session. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Harris. Okay, so obviously what we heard there was sort of a conceptual framework of how to think about food fraud in the context of managing your supply chain and managing risk. And what I'm going to talk about is really how to consider analysis as a tool within that framework, and some key concepts that will help really help you make the right decisions when it comes to which testing to do. And in the process of the talk, I'll also describe two of the main, a bit of detail on how the two of the main kind of tests that we do, or that one does in the food industry, how they work, and that will hopefully, understanding how it works will hopefully allow you to see where it can be used in your own daily life. Okay, so, well, obviously we're talking about authenticity, and the first thing we have to ask here is, what does it mean to ask if something is authentic? So, you know, we regularly get contacted, and sometimes the question is, well, we want to check that this flavor is authentic, and what does it mean to say that, you know, a flavorant is authentic? So usually it's something to do with, you know, what does it say on the label? But often it's something a bit more nebulous, like, is there a mismatch between what the consumer understands they're buying and what the, you know, the supplier or distributor is providing? So an example of that would be with wasabi. So, you know, when maybe people in the industry understand that wasabi is a specific species of plant, but when you go to a sushi restaurant and you get given what is called wasabi, you know, that is obviously by and large not really wasabi, it's, you know, mustard. So there are a number of different ways that that authenticity can be a problem, but the two major ones are usually to do with origin. Is it what it says it is, whether it's the actual species of thing that you're selling, or is it did it originate from the geographical location that you've described it being from? And then there are things relating to production methods, which are much more various, but include, you know, things like organic and vegan and pesticide free and that kind of thing. So obviously you have to take a risk-based approach. We can't test everything. Well, you can test everything, but that's obviously very expensive. So you have to look at what are the risks that you're trying to cover for, and that obviously involves the whole process of horizon scanning and looking at prior incidents. But generally speaking, the likely candidates are things that obviously have intrinsic value. So you want to be looking at the most expensive ingredient or the one with the most cachet. So this can be something to do with where it's from, or, you know, for example, the difference between olive oil and other oils. It has, you know, prestige. There are also quality characteristics that, you know, sort of that certain oils and certain products have. And a sort of a good rule of thumb is to look at the microeconomics. If there's a high demand or a low supply for something, or a limited supply for something, then that's something that you should flag. So a lot of companies sometimes feel that authenticity testing is it's just an additional cost, and it's true that it is an additional cost, but I think another way to look at it is an opportunity to really secure your quality signals and show that you're complying with labeling regulations, and I think it supports branding. If, you know, the consumer can trust what you're selling, then that's obviously a good thing. Okay, so when we talk about testing, we have to decide what are we testing? And to know that, we have to decide what question we're asking. And here it helps to have a question that actually has an answer. So there's a nice example that I've heard, that, you know, the number of birds in flight over the Earth is a question you can ask. It definitely has an answer, but it's very difficult to obtain. The other sort of inverse of that is, well, you know, what does it mean to say hormone-free? What is hormone-free meat? There is no such thing, because, you know, meat comes from animals and animals have hormones, but is there a normal range, and is it higher than that? And so really defining accurately the question that you want to ask helps you in deciding, you know, which test is appropriate and which lab you should be talking to do that. Now, there are sort of two major types of tests. There are qualitative sort of presence-absence type tests, and there are quantitative tests. Now, when it comes to quantitative tests, the sort of questions you should be asking are, well, is there a legal limit? Is there a regulation surrounding this? And we're testing within the framework of that. And then, of course, does the test, is it capable of testing to those detection limits? And is it quantifiable in that range? And if there isn't a regulation and you're looking for basically signs that something's up, then you need to know what the normal distribution is. So, for example, again, just to go back to the meat and hormone analogy, if you test for a hormone and you have a value of 10, well, what does that mean? Is that high or low, or is that, you know, totally acceptable? Now, usually when we conduct analysis in the food industry, we're looking at basically, we can be working in the sort of range here of atoms, molecules, and macromolecules. We don't really go higher than that, and we definitely don't go lower than that. So another major concept that I just want to quickly touch on before we go into some methods is the difference between targeted and untargeted analysis. Now, I'm going to loop back to this again a bit later because I see this as a way for food companies to basically maximize the impact of their authenticity testing. So targeted analysis involves selecting an actual substance you're testing for. You need to know how it behaves, how it behaves under the conditions in which you're testing it. But basically, you're looking for one marker, and that, for example, would be, say, HMF in honey testing. Now, you know that HMF signifies something, and you know how it behaves, and you know how it behaves in the test, and so you can quantify that thing quite easily. But the other way to think about it is to look at untargeted analysis, where rather than testing for one particular molecule or element or whatnot, you're looking at a range of related analytes. And I like to think about this as more like a fingerprint. And the concept that I'm going to mention now, but I want to come back to later, is that a targeted analysis is usually much more sensitive, but it's easier to trick. Whereas an untargeted analysis creates a profile that is much more difficult to forge and to beat the test with. Okay, so we'll just come on quickly to some molecular techniques. So molecular techniques come from the field of cell biology and biochemistry, and we're basically talking about DNA, well, nucleic acids and amino acids. Of course, sugars and fats are also biomolecules, but the term molecular techniques generally denotes the testing of DNA and proteins. RNA is there as well, but we don't really do a lot of that in the food industry. So probably the most common molecular technique in the world, in fact, I'm pretty sure it is the most common molecular technique in the world, is PCR. Now, PCR is very effective when you're just trying to confirm the presence or absence of something. So it's very good as a qualitative tool. It's reasonably cheap, and it can be used to test for a whole range of things, confirming the authenticity of teas and spices and confirming the absence of GMOs. Now, a key thing to mention here is that it requires, it has prerequisites. So this is important when you're considering novel food sources, novel protein sources, or anything like that, that you actually need to have some information before you can get started. You probably remember this from university, but PCR is polymerase chain reaction. It is used for the amplification of a target, and the way it works is you have basically some primers that are sequence specific. They anneal, and an enzyme takes free nucleotides and creates a new copy of the target DNA. And now, obviously, this is just one cycle. So if you had one target of your say, fish species DNA in a tube, after one cycle you have 2, and then after 2 cycles you have 4, and so on and so forth. And then you can visualize it. And this is a very cheap and effective way of confirming whether something is present or absent. Now, of course, as I mentioned earlier, you need to have the bioinformatic prerequisite knowledge for that. In this case, knowing the sequence of your targets and designing some primers that have a specific sequence. Another PCR-based tool that is quantitative or semi-quantitative is to use qPCR. Now, this works in exactly the same way. However, you visualize the real-time amplification of the target over the cycles. So you can see at the bottom here the number of cycles, and you can see fluorescence. Fluorescence is the way that the amplification is being detected. And basically, the earlier in the number of cycles that something amplifies correlates directly with the amount of target that there was present. So, for example, this has been used in our laboratory to quantify the amount of true wasabi in a wasabi mix. So something that claims to have wasabi in, is the wasabi there at all? And if so, how much relative to the total ingredients? Now, barcoding is another variant of PCR. It's actually just a PCR plus an additional step. Now, the purpose of this is when you want to confirm a specific species. Now, the way this is done is fairly simple. The clever people in the field of zoology and phylogenetics have identified specific regions in different species DNA that varies by enough to tell the different species apart, but not by enough that means the PCR doesn't work. And so what you do is you amplify that region, and then you sequence it. And the sequence itself can identify the species of interest. Now, there was a case study was published a little while ago, and we noticed in the field of food safety that actually very often the standard tests that were being used, to look at total plate counts and to look at the individual species of bacteria were or the different types of bacteria were causing some confusion. So the fact that some pathogens were being specifically looked for was becoming seen as that was the purpose of the testing, and people were ignoring the actual total plate count because, of course, for every species that actually grows and is a known pathogen, there are thousands of others that are still pathogens, but you're not sure that are not present. So sequencing in that case would be a very useful thing to do. So if you do have something that you need to identify, then barcoding is really the tool that is the easiest to use for that. Now, another similar to PCR is probe-based detection methods. Now, this is what was used in the horse meat scandal to identify the presence of different species of DNA, DNA from different species, I should say. And the way this works is through a target-specific sequence that is attached to a probe, which can be detected actually in a similar way to qPCR. The upshot of this is you can simultaneously screen a mixture of samples in a semi-quantitative way for the presence of a number of different things at the same time. And that's been a very useful technique. Now, sequencing applications are techniques that are going to be growing in importance in the food industry going forward, especially in food authenticity. And a really interesting sort of concept to take on board here, and why it's becoming why it's going to be so important, is simply to do with the information you get for the cost. Now, a good example to illustrate the drop in price in this technology is how the Human Genome Project cost, $5 billion 13 years ago, and involved 6 countries and loads of institutions. If you just look at the actual cost per million bases, bases obviously the unit in which you sequence, it was 1.5 million per million base pairs back then in '98, and today it's actually less than 10 cents per million base pairs. So the fall in cost has been dramatic, and this is going to be really important because it's going to allow the quantification of multiple species accurately in different mixtures, whether that's spices or meat or in microbial populations. So even in the field of food safety, doing rather than is there listeria here, we can say what is the bacteria here, and look for all of them in one shot. And the cost crossover point here is approaching. So the point at which sequencing all of the bacteria in a given region, or all of the meat species in a given product, and identifying them is actually going to be cheaper than trying to just identify one, which obviously has huge benefits with capacity and information, turnaround times, in fact, because of the lack of need for growing and culturing, and it's much more accurate. There's a much lower chance of any human errors creeping in there. I'm going to gloss over proteins and fats somewhat, and there are a range of techniques that are used in food authenticity testing to identify the profiles of proteins, the profiles of fats, and there are some emerging technologies that are really going to make this more cost effective. But I should note that outside of actual allergen testing, the uses of these kind of biochemical techniques are almost out of scope. They tend to remain research-based techniques at the moment. Chromatography is probably the most powerful tool that we have at our disposal for identifying the presence or absence and quantification of nearly anything. For our purposes, gas and liquid chromatography are the main resolving different techniques. And the point of chromatography is to separate chemically similar components based on their charge, their polarity, or their size. Now, you can see in this example, the green balls are a matrix, and here we have a purple dye, and it consists of a red molecule and a blue molecule. Now you can see that the red molecule is smaller, and in this maze of matrix, the red molecule will move through it, given some pressure on this side. The red molecule will move through it faster than the blue molecule, which will face more resistance. And what that means is let's say this is the column now, turned it vertically. You have a purple dye, and it separates over time into two different solutions. So you can actually take something that was a mixture, and you can separate them out individually. Now, this turns out that this very simple principle is extremely powerful. Because once you basically attach something onto the bottom here to detect these different molecules, you can start quantifying specific things in a complicated mixture. So we have a variety of instruments to deploy here. We can use UV detection, we can use mass spec detection. There are a number of different things that you can use. One thing to bear in mind is that firstly, to make this type of analysis quantitative as opposed to qualitative, there are a number of different prerequisites that need to be demonstrated, and that involves method development. So if the thing you want quantified is something that hasn't been quantified previously, or there's very little data on, then that's going to require a little bit of R&D. The limits of detection have to be empirically determined for a system. So there is no one limit of detection for a given technique or a different analyte. And the other thing to bear in mind is a slight disadvantage of being in South Africa is that standards have to be brought in from specialized chemical companies, and these are not always available or not always easy to import into South Africa. Okay, another widespread method used in food is basically spectroscopic methods, and the most common that you'll have heard of is infrared spectroscopy. Now this has got a lot of potential applications, a lot of real applications. Now, if the matrix you're testing, let's say that you test spices or you test wine, this can be a very cheap and powerful technique to quantify a number of different analytes. The key point I want to make about this this technique is it's not a panacea. People like it because it doesn't involve any sample processing. But if you see here, this is an ethanol spectrum on an infrared. Now, if you added in 5 other chemicals, you're going to have overlapping peaks here, which again is not really a problem so long as you're testing the same thing every time. You can build a computer model to discriminate to quantify and determine the area of these peaks. But now, if you change from wine to spices, then obviously the model that you've built is suddenly not accurate at all. So that's just something to bear in mind when considering what kind of analytical technique you want to use. It's very good in factories, of course. Okay, isotopic methods are really great. They can be used for a number of different things, but basically anything that involves changes in isotopes. Now, isotopes change in natural products because of the abundance of these different heavy isotopes in nature. So you're really thinking about agricultural practices, the region where something was grown, how far something was away. You can kind of tell the difference between a European vegetable and an American vegetable this way. But one use for this method that caught on hugely was the use of isotope ratio analysis in honey authenticity. And I think this was very much a case of if you've got a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. Because although it was useful in determining, in identifying the addition of cheap sugars from some sources, notably carbon-4 plants, it was not able to distinguish between cheap syrups added and true honey for carbon-3 plants, which actually happens to include rice syrup. So you can imagine, as large amounts of honey were produced in the Far East, they could slip in completely undetected using this method, which had become essentially unquestioningly adopted by the analytical industry. Okay. So in the real world, what does all this mean? Well, you've got food safety, which is your top priority, and then you've got to manage your supply chain vulnerabilities. This involves food authenticity, which we've been talking about, and food quality. And there are two different types of analyses you can use. You can use targeted and untargeted analysis. And what I would say is, if you can combine these two groups of tests, and if you can focus on untargeted types of analysis, that will allow you to maximize the coverage of the analytes that you're testing and minimize the costs, because you may be doing fewer tests and those tests may not be much more expensive than the methods that you are traditionally using. So an example here is we've got chili powder, and you can look for illegal dyes and you can look for pesticides. And there's dye testing and there's LCMS that's used to identify pesticides. Now, what this table doesn't tell you is that you can add the illegal dye testing onto this method. So if you have a common set of tests that you're looking at, and you're being charged for 10 different tests for one food item, it's often worth considering or speaking to an expert how you can combine and really maximize and reduce your costs on your testing. Just in summary, first of all, you have to frame the question. You have to know what you're testing, and you have to have a specific question that you want to answer. And then you need to consider what technique is appropriate to answer the question. Now, of course, most people are not going to be able to help you with this, but speaking to people like us or a laboratory you trust about what techniques are appropriate. Techniques have a number of different, as you've seen, a number of different factors that they have completely different fundamental principles and different capabilities. The key thing to remember as well is that the technology involved in applying these techniques changes over time, and so does the market. Just because a test has been used for the last 10 years does not mean that it's still appropriate, because firstly, there could be technologies in place that make it more cost effective, that beat out the old test, and basically fraudsters learn how to cheat the test. If you're only testing for HMF for your honey authenticity or your honey quality, well, someone out there knows how to chemically convert HMF into something else that's not detected by that test. The thing that I've been trying to suggest is that untargeted techniques can often be better. That's not obviously a golden rule, but it's just something to consider. And you can look for trying to combine parameters together, and that will make your tests harder to cheat. Thank you very much. I think we'll have some questions.
Hi, Karim. Thank you. That was really, really great. I learned a lot, and I think it's a great platform for us to start some of the questions with regards to the presentation. So for those of you out there that have been listening, please won't you pop us a question on your question and answer block, because that'll help me to channel the questions. I've got a few in the meantime, so while you're quickly typing those in, I'm going to start with some questions for both Harris and for Karim. Harris, you mentioned the fact that there's a number of ways of us finding out when things are going wrong, and one of those being whistleblowing. What's your experience with regards to whistleblowing in South Africa? Are you finding this on the increase? Is this something that we possibly should be even advertising to try and get more information coming out of the market to help us to eradicate some of these problems?
Thanks for the question. It's actually a very relevant and important question. I think there's too little whistleblowing, and I think the reason for that is because the authorities that you would normally whistleblow to are either incompetent or dead in the water. We know that the system is partly at fault as well as the resources available. So you could theoretically complain to Directorate Food Control or DAF. It's unlikely to get you anywhere. You can complain to the National Consumer Commission, which I know a number of people have complained to about different food issues. Nowhere. You can complain to the provincial heads that look after environmental health officers, get you nowhere. ASA is dead in the water. As you know, it was liquidated, although there's a new group called ABR. that does not mean that one should not make an effort. And I do know that people sometimes phone me and ask, what can they do? And I obviously try and link into my network and try and get that information up. But I think we have to continue to put pressure on the whole system and push for change, and change will come. It's for a few good reasons. One, it protects your company. It creates a level playing field, which is for me very, very important. And it drives, hopefully, regulations to improve. And what I mean by putting pressure on the system is that we've seen it in, for example, in the cereals, breakfast cereal industry. If one company starts abusing legislative compliance with how they label their boxes, a competitor then has to jump in and say, well, I need to compete with that because they're taking market shares. Then they start doing the next step, and so forth. And soon you have almost the whole industry starting to abuse the system. And the eventual loser is the consumer, but also you as a company, because if you're trying to be ethical, you are under major pressure. So in conclusion, I would argue that it is important for whistleblowers to make an effort to try and deal with appropriate pathways to put pressure on the system to improve.
And I think ultimately, if this information is getting to the consumer face, in other words, it's something that is appearing on carte blanche a little more regularly, Harris, perhaps this is the way that industry will realize that this information is, you know, this is not something to play with. We don't like to be tricked as consumers. It's just ethically and morally not correct.
Absolutely, and I think what people should understand is that if you take one big hit on, say, carte blanche, it affects your brand incredibly severely.
Absolutely. I can't really imagine the world without chocolate and coffee. So after your discussion about what's coming, I had to say I felt extremely depressed for a couple of minutes. But yeah, I think, you know, the clear impact of climate change is something that we have to consider, not just, you know, for warm and fuzzy feelings, but because of the commercial impact that it has. And I would be very interesting to ask the food companies out there whether they're actually, you know, are taking active measures to consider this this particular risk. I also noted, Harris, some interesting comments. You mentioned the focus, the increasing focus on aquaculture. Very interesting, you know, from that FAO report, as well as the increased public attention on food safety. So I think that at least tells us that, you know, the work that FACTS has been doing, particularly around fish species and that kind of thing, is definitely on par and on the mark as far as international developments are concerned.
I think you've raised a very interesting example. You know, as we know that fish species is under stress, aquaculture is increasing. But what we don't understand is climate change. It's predicted that the warm oceans will cause algal blooms. Now, so you, on one hand, trying to sort out a loss of a particular fish species by doing aquaculture, and you blindly forget that climate change might result in another condition that can affect your solution. And that's why it's so important to see the full and big picture.
Absolutely. Okay, a couple of specific questions have come through. Thank you, Almay. The impact of your discussion on farmers. So milk can obviously be adulterated, and I think you've shown, you know, from the trends that dairy products are increasingly becoming adulterated based on the information from the Discernus database. How can a farmer practically, you know, evaluate it and develop procedures that make sense, not just from an academic perspective, but I think we're now talking about sort of small scale processes. You know, are there easy things that they could consider, and how should they be evaluating these potential problems?
Well, it's yeah. I mean, I think sort of taking ownership of doing what prevention you can is really important. It's obviously very difficult for the farmer because, you know, what are they? Once they've sold their products into markets, it's really only after that usually these things creep in. I mean, I'm not sure, Harris. I think adulteration and food fraud is it's unlikely to be occurring at the point of the farmer. It's really downstream of that's really the risk. But I think maybe you know, one thing that the farmer could do is, you know, to basically express that they are concerned about these issues and actually to you know, taking a principled stance on that, and actually even being proactive and asking, you know, their clients what is being done with the product and how can they be sure that that their own reputations are protected. Because of course, you know, if you're the farmer that has been supplying some product that gets adulterated and then is caught in some scandal, you know, down the road, further down the supply chain, then your business is also going to be impacted.
I'd like to add to that. I think, you know, for small farmer, generally, well, as Karim said, most of the adulteration will occur at a more manufacturing level. But from a small farmer point of view, one can consider what are the risks to your milk production. And there is where you don't know enough about antibiotic use, where you're injecting your animals and you forget there's a window period before you milk them. Or a greater problem, and we see that in the food industry, and that's got to do with your suppliers of your raw ingredients. So if you as a farmer buying animal feed for your animals, are you absolutely certain that what they're supplying you is pesticide-free or antibiotic free? We've heard that there are some ingredient suppliers of animal food that puts antibiotics into the feed. Now, is that a risk to your milk production? So in a sense, the farmer has to understand not just what's happening on his farm, but what is the quality of the raw ingredients that is coming onto the farm, and how is that likely to affect the milk production or the quality of the milk that is being produced.
Absolutely, and that brings us to Joy's question. You know, if you're a small blending facility, so, you know, spices or those kinds of things, again, we've got this cost-benefit ratio. So the costs are either, you know, prohibitive because they've got so many ingredients that they're bringing in. Where can we rely or depend on the supplier authenticity tests and supplier ingredients, you know, or supplier agreements? I think, you know, obviously the information that you've shared about scandals around the world definitely put into question any kind of supplier agreement or certificate of you know, analysis that is possibly presented. What's your gut feel around giving this all to the supplier?
Well, trust is obviously enormously important, and I think what we've described is, you know, a process of looking for weaknesses in the chain and likely areas where trust could break down, where the sort of commercial imperatives and the weaknesses are closest to the surface, if I can use that mixed metaphor. But then, you know, once you've established a relationship with a supplier and you've confirmed their results, then, you know, it's true. There's very little one can do apart from, you know, keep an eye on developments. So, you know, let's just use an example here, just from, you know, the technological side. If you had to microscopically analyze, say, 20 different spices every single time you received a new batch, that would be, of course, very prohibitive in terms of cost. It may be worth it if you have a brand to protect, but there you are. Now, you know, next generation sequencing technologies, for example, you might be able to confirm the species of all of the spices you're receiving and identify anything that shouldn't be there in a one very low cost test. And that's the kind of thing where, you know, at the moment, yes, you have to depend on trust, but, you know, in the future, that's probably not going to be necessary as costs do fall. but that's my sort of techno-optimist kind of viewpoint. Harris will probably have a more pessimistic view.
Yes, I'll give two pessimistic examples we've seen. The one is of meat species, authentically beef coming in from Brazil, checked here and found it was actually buffalo. And what possibly happened is that beef was sent for testing, but the company actually supplied buffalo in contrary to the COA. And so there was clear fraud involved. But the other area that one has to also consider with COA is how they might drift. And so you might have a batch of, say, wheat coming from overseas that is aflatoxin free, but it's stored in a tanker container that's now moving across the ocean and takes 21 days or so to get to South Africa. And if it's not stored properly, we will find here that the aflatoxin level is now very high. And that's not because of the supplier having cheated, but because of the way the product changed as it drifted across the ocean. So one has to look at COAs from different perspectives.
Absolutely. And I think also the reality is that, you know, the South African legislation always puts the onus on you as the supplier of food coming, you know, whether you're importing it, whether you're manufacturing it, or whether you're selling it. So, you know, unfortunately, I don't think we can necessarily say, well, sorry, Your Honor, it was too expensive for us to do this. I think your comment about the price, you know, as soon as there's a change in price, that should give you an indication that there's possibly something afoot, and we should pay a bit more attention. We've got a great comment here. Zena, thank you so much. Fantastic information as usual. Her comment is in relation to the confusion. So the business impact of food fraud versus the impact of food safety. So should food fraud consider only the food safety impact when doing an assessment, or the business impact as well? I think the question here, Harris, you've already answered, because as you mentioned, it only takes one episode of carte blanche to destroy your reputation. And so it's not just food safety, but it's also the impact on the business and reputational risk. Would you agree?
Absolutely. I think one just has to look at Sudan Red. Sudan Red was not particularly a toxic compound, except long-term using a product regularly. But once the story broke in Sunday Times, it was massive because there was major outrage. So the food safety was lower than the food safety was apparently higher than the actual relative value of it. At the same time, people feel cheated. So sometimes it's not about safety. It's about the fact that consumers feel incredibly cheated. And both of them will impact your brand incredibly badly.
Yeah, I think
absolutely.
It's a hierarchy.
Yeah, go ahead.
Obviously, sorry. So, you know, obviously, food safety is paramount, and these, you know, they're not, you know, although the framework describes them as, you know, discrete levels. You know, you've got your HACCP, FACCP, TACCP. Obviously, they bleed into each other, and there are some food fraud issues that bleed into food safety. Whether it's, you know, the addition of compounds that aren't meant to be there, or it's you're actually selling a product that is no longer what your label says, and that's a risk to consumers. I mean, they are still food safety issues, even though they don't fall under the, you know, traditional umbrella of that.
Yeah, I think we don't have to say very much about Listeria and Tiger Brands as a good example of things going horribly wrong.
And I think that also brings us to her next point, that being, you know, VASIP generally sits under the care of the quality department. However, when you look at, you know, some of these issues, surely it needs to be higher up the chain within the organization. You know, the board, you know, of a business, definitely the procurement executives, because there are implications here that, you know, from a commercial perspective, it's not just what's on the label necessarily, or it's not just what's going in as an ingredient.
Linda, I think you've touched on an incredibly critical point that is close to our hearts, and that is that in most companies, and I know I'm generalizing, that the food safety culture does not extend all the way up to the CEO. It's left at the lower ends of the chain. And one of the people who put in their fingers very strongly into this and caused major problem are marketers. I've often been asked for opinion by the food developers on an ingredient that they feel should not be used or at a particular limit. But there's major pressures from the marketers to, say, extend the lifespan of the product on the market, and there's pressure on the food developers to do so. And the CEOs and the people at the top who don't understand enough about food safety or risk put pressure, agree with the marketers. And so food developers are often incredibly constrained in what they want to do and cannot do.
Absolutely, and I think that's where Zinat is saying perhaps we should take these presentations, gentlemen, and we should take them higher up the chain to the board members, and possibly we should be looking at this as a module within marketing. You know, when it comes to ethical marketing, when we look at sort of general marketing discussions within qualifications. We've run out of time, and which is great because that means that we're still here and we're all still very interested, and we are absolutely delighted by the information that you've shared with us. Karim, what I learned from your presentation is that there is a menu of tests that you can offer me, and I think it's really important that, you know, if a client approaches you, it's really important for them to understand what they're trying to achieve, but it's obviously an area where you will definitely be able to assist them in defining what would be the best value for money in order to identify the problems that they may be facing, and also then to be able to monitor their suppliers on an ongoing basis. Definitely had some flashbacks of biochemical pracs a very, very long time ago in a dark and dingy Wits University laboratory. So thank you very much. Facts, thank you so much for sponsoring this webinar. Thank you for the information that you've shared with us. For those of you that have spent the last hour and 10 minutes with us, thank you so much for being with us. If you have any other questions, please feel free to drop us a line, linda@foodfocus.coza. We will make sure that these questions are passed on to Karim and Harris, and look forward to picking up on this recording and sharing it with your colleagues. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your Thursday.
Thank you.